welcome back to another episode of the Mana Daily Podcast. Today, I am joined by a controversial individual, simply for doing his due diligence and researching a topic that is a little bit going around in Christian circles that I would like to explore. I personally suspect when I've heard about this little season theory, that it sounds a little nefarious. It didn't make sense to me theologically speaking. I wanted to talk to somebody that's more in depth with the research, because again, there's some things I do not know, and I think it's good to have Christian fellowship where we get this stuff out there on the table, try to find out where things come from, where things are going. So I am joined by Ed Mabrie, who's writing a book actually on this particular topic. So I'm going to let him kind of divulge a little bit about what prompted him to dig into this particular topic. And again, thank you, Ed, for coming on to the show.
Well, thank you for having me, Brandon. I appreciate it. And yeah, as you said, this idea that we're in the little season of Satan, this little season theory has been exploding over the last few years. And so I started exploring it because I started to get questions about it from my followers. And yeah, and the reaction of people one way or the other is usually pretty visceral. And there's some interesting ideas, interesting thoughts I have behind that. And putting it all together and doing the research that I've done, I decided it would be really prudent to do a book on it, to have some type of reference source for people instead of trying to hunt around to find the different podcasts I've been on about it, or trying to hunt down my videos. Then we have a book available, and something you can have to download or print out.
Nice. So, first, what's the title of it, if we're allowed to?
You know what? I haven't finalized a title yet. So
Okay.
my working title, and this might change, is that the little season of Satan. Is it hidden history or heresy?
Ooh,
Ooh, we'll see.
nice,
We'll see how
nice.
that works in the marketplace. So I'll do a little market testing and see. But that's what I titled my initial video on it that I did almost a year ago when I
Okay.
was first diving into this.
So,
And it's I am planning on having it ready to go by the beginning of May.
beginning of May. Okay.
Yeah. So
So,
about a month from now.
if we could just rewind just for a second, give your testimony,
Sure.
quote unquote, your credentials of how you came to become a Christian, and then kind of talk about how you got into the ministry aspect and getting a following and creating a platform.
Sure. So I literally grew up in the church. My grandmother was the matriarch of our church. Literally, everyone went to her when they needed something. She helped build the church that I grew up in. My father's a minister. He became a minister a little later on, but so obviously I've been exposed to the Bible from a young age, and
Mhm.
but always had an inquisitive mind. I've always questioned things. I'm just that type of person. I'm someone who asks why. I need a reason to believe things. So, of course, I believed in God, I believed in Jesus from an early age, but I always had questions about some of the things in the Bible and the way God did things the way he did. What was his personality? What was his methodology? Why? So, why did he flood the earth and kill everybody in Genesis? Why did he make the tree of the knowledge of good and evil? Why did he make the angels and who fell, and one of them became the one entity we call Satan? But why did Jesus have to be born of a virgin? Why did he die? So I have all these questions, and I would pepper the the ministers of my church with the questions. And I think they eventually got a little tired of me, and they just said, it's not right to question God. I'm like, oh well, okay, I guess I'll stop things. I don't want to make God angry, so I'll stop questioning God. So I essentially grew up not questioning my faith, not having any type of apologetics, which was fine growing up because again, growing up in a church in the neighborhood that I grew up in, I'm primarily in an African American community where it was taken for granted. Even when I went to public school, it was, we were taught evolution, but we were like, but the idea was like everyone still believed in God.
Right.
Then I went to college, went to a secular university, which most of them are. And my professors and my fellow students took delight in deconstructing my Christianity. I in one of the papers I wrote in my one of my early anthropology classes, we had to use 5 references, and one of the references I used in my anthropology class was the Bible, and I got a B on that paper, and I thought I deserved higher than that. So I went to my professor and I said, "Well, why did I get this lower grade?" And she said, "Well, because you used the Bible." I'm like, "What's wrong with that?" And she literally laughed in my face and said the Bible is not reliable. It is not a verifiable source of information. It was created by a bunch of of ancient Jewish people who copied their God from the ancient Canaanite gods, that the Jehovah, the Yahweh of the Bible, is actually an ancient Canaanite vengeance deity that they just um, um, took over.
Developed.
They,
Yeah.
yeah, 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 exactly. They appropriated him, and they created their religion. It's not historically accurate. If there was a Jesus, then he was just an itinerant rabbi who was a rebel against the Roman Empire, which you actually hear from Ben Shapiro, interestingly. And yeah, so and the disciples just made up the fact that Jesus was the idea that Jesus was a deity, so forth and so on. And but since I never questioned it, I had no apologetics behind me. I couldn't combat it. And my fellow students, they would ask me questions like, well, the classics. If God is good and loving, why is there evil in the world? And which, by the way, is how we're going to wrap this up with that actual question, because I think that's something that's behind the reason that people embrace the little season. But in any case, I didn't have answers for them. So I left college spiritually wrecked. I mean, I still believed in God, but I questioned everything I'd been taught about God because it didn't make sense. And things have to make sense to me. That is my burden, and my gift and my burden is that things have to make sense to me. And if they don't, they bother me until I figure it out. So I started a journey of trying to understand what was true. I just wanted truth, no matter where it went. And so I explored other religions. I looked at all these different esoteric teachings. But eventually my prayer to God was like, God, if you're real, then what you say and what you do, your character, your existence should match up with logic and reason, because you would have created logic and reason. And to God's credit, he answered that prayer. He pointed me to resources and to people who were, much smarter than me, much more learned, and went on a similar journey. And people like Chuck Missler, who was one of my mentors, and Dr. Michael Heiser, who, again, brilliant scholars, and reading their work, I said, okay, this does make sense. It actually does. So it led me back to my Christian faith. And I discovered a couple of things. One is that God can be known to the extent that we're capable. And even more importantly, God wants to be known. That's why he inspired the Bible. The Bible is not a book of history, is not a book of inspiration, it's not a guide to life. Now, it has those aspects in it. There's certainly history in the Bible. There's certainly inspiration in the Bible. There's certainly guidance there. But that's not what the point of the Bible was. The point of the Bible is to give us Yahweh's, Jehovah's story. Why? Why would anyone give you their story? In order for you to know them. So people, unfortunately, many Christians treat the Bible like a textbook, the same way we would treat our high school history book. We look for, okay, I want to know about faith. Let's go to the chapter on faith. I want to know about love. Let's go to the chapter on love. That's not what it's meant to be. It's not a textbook. It's a story. It's a series of stories. I kind of relate it to the old movie Pulp Fiction. It's old. I mean, modern to me, but in that movie, you have a bunch of different stories that are loosely connected. But when you look at them as a whole, they tell a complete story.
Yeah.
That's what the Bible does. God wants us to know his story. Just knowing facts about someone doesn't help you know them. I mean, if you wanted to know me and I just told you, okay, here's the city I was born in. Here is where I went to school. Here's my GPA. Here's my address. Oh, you know facts, but that doesn't tell you about me. If you want to know about me, then listen to the story I'm telling now. Listen to my story about how I grew up, what I liked and didn't like as a kid, the kind of trouble I got into, who was my first crush, who was the first person who broke my heart, what kind of things do I do for fun? Those kind of things help you know me, stories. So the purpose of the Bible is to help us know who God is intimately. And that's what I'm going to start talking about in a few minutes as we get into this. But that was the purpose of it. So to wrap it all up, the reason I started Faith by Reason was because I figured that there were Christians who were on the same or similar journey as me. And I wanted to give them resources and help them understand why our faith makes sense using logic, reason, and systematic analysis. Not just, believe God because somebody says so. No, believe him because it should make sense. So that's why I started my website, over a decade ago, faithbyreason.net. So there's hundreds of hours of material there. I would take advantage of it quickly because I'm going to start putting some of it behind a paywall as everything as what I'm doing is growing.
Yeah.
I'm pointing people to my Patreon right now as a primary source because that's where I get my support from my patrons. I appreciate them greatly. It's patreon.com/faithbyreason. If you become a tier 1 Patreon, you get first access to all my content. I'm putting my content on there first, including my books. And they can access it usually at no charge or at least a discount. I do exclusive bonus episodes that I don't put out into public spaces because I'm on the verge of probably being banned by YouTube because I've got 2 strikes against me already, and so that's where you go so you get that and you get a Q&A. I do a weekly Q&A. If you send questions in, I do a video where I answer them. And if you want to level up to the next tier, then you get all that. Plus, you also get to be a part of a monthly Bible study that I do, where we go through the entire Bible in 1 year, 1 month at a time, just study notes every week. But we explore the Bible from the spiritual or the supernatural point of view, because that's 80% of the Bible. And if you
Mhm.
don't understand the spiritual aspect, you're not understanding the Bible. I think the reason why a lot of people have trouble with what the Bible says, because they're looking at it from the human standpoint. The Bible is not our story, it's God's story, and God is spiritual. He is in heaven, and so we need to know what's going on behind the scenes, and that's what we do. So that's in a nutshell, Faith by Reason.
Wow, dude, I love it. I had a similar thing. I went to a very denominationally focused school,
Mhm.
and there was a lot of times I was with the professors, and I'm like, how is it I know more about this historical event than you do? Because again, I don't want to know just about the highlights of the war, like you were saying, look up the love, look up the. I want to know what led up to it,
Right.
and it was getting to a point where again, just learn the scripture verse, but why? Where am I ever going to use this verse to witness to somebody? It doesn't make any sense
Yep.
to me. So when and then I came home. I went to a community school. I met a professor. He taught me how to read between the text of context of just
Mhm.
ancient, the Aeneid, the and all the Odyssey and stuff like that. And dude, and then I stumbled into Heiser,
Yeah.
and it
Okay.
revolutionized the way I read
Yep.
the Bible. And
Same.
and, and
Yeah.
yeah, it really was helpful for me. And now going to church, it's not the same anymore. It's just like, dude, there's so much more context right here. So I'm loving hearing how you've as well went through a similar journey. Um, so I guess specifically, when did it start happening in your I don't know, in your ministry? When did it start popping up hearing about this little season of Satan going on? What was the first little rumblings you've heard of this movement, and it prompted your curiosity to look into it further?
Yeah, roughly about a year and a half ago, I was hearing the word "little season" here and there but I didn't pay much attention to it. I wasn't really sure what they were. I knew what the words were because I studied Revelation intensely. In fact, I have a 60 episode series on Revelation where I break it down verse by verse, so I knew what it was. And so I would hear it there mostly by people who um, I I wouldn't consider them the most Christian, almost literate Christian types. They were just, a lot of conspiracy podcasts, which I really like, and I get into those. But they would say, "Oh, little season, okay, whatever." But I started getting questions from my followers. Someone asked me, "Ed, do you think we are in the little season of Satan?" And I said, "Of course not. That's after the millennium. That's way in the future." And I said, "What an odd question." And I kind of moved on. But then I started hearing it more and more,
Mhm.
and people saying that this is becoming popular. You need to look into it and listen to the people who are talking about it. And so I did, and I started saying, wow, there are a lot of people talking about this. And so I did some research into it. I looked into what they were saying and what their explanation was, and I was like, this does not fit at all. But you know what, let me look at it. I could be wrong, and I want the truth. So let me just see if it actually fits with the Bible. And I just saw that not only did it not fit, but it's dangerous. There is a danger to it. And so I put out a video about roughly a year ago, a little less than a year ago, just kind of breaking down highlights, just a very big picture, all the things that the Bible says and what the little season says and how they really don't fit and how it just doesn't work out. And so I put it up, not knowing the firestorm I was creating. I just got it became unintentionally one of the most popular videos that I put out, in a good or bad way. I just got half the people were like, okay, thanks for letting us know this. This makes sense what you're saying. But a lot of people were just really, really upset. I mean, very emotional. And they would say, you know what, you need to do more research. And I was accused of being a tool of the elites, or I was controlled opposition. And they would just throw all these odd little I would just call
Slurs
them
and
shoddy.
digs.
Yeah, conspiracy
Yeah.
theories and just really shoddy evidence at me. And I'm like, why is this so popular? And but what I begin to think that some of these people were bots because they were saying the exact same thing. It's always you need to do more research. What if this, that, and the other, or why can't it be this? And it just didn't make much sense to me. But I said, okay, I'll do more research. Maybe I'm missing something. But that was not a good thing to ask me to do because the more research I did, the worse this theory became and the less sense it made. And it really led me to just say why to question the mentality of what's going on here. I said there must be an agenda behind it. And as I discovered, there actually is. There are two agendas behind it. One is nefarious, one is tragic. And well, I'm going to do maybe the second half or the last third of this talking about where those agendas came from. But doing all that research, it led me to write this book. So for the little season adherence, I listened to you, and the result was now I have a whole book out instead of just a video and a few appearances on podcasts. Now you inspired a book.
I love it. Like, dude, and that's I chuckle with a lot of people because it's just like they write the comments, but they don't bother to hear. Like, they want to hear their truth coming out of
Right.
your mouth, and unless you agree with it, and the second thing, what I noted, what you just said, they become emotional, and that's the
Very.
first sign. If you're emotionally angry at somebody, I'll say with a lot of my stuff, I could be wrong, but I'm just pitching it. Here's a whole bunch of stuff.
Mhm.
Could be wrong. Dig into it for yourself, right? But when they become emotionally reactive, that is the first red flag of there's something wrong with this. Because if you're getting angry over something that is just a perspective, that's usually a sign of a false spirit. If you because you just tested it and now it's angry. And why is it agitated? I want to know why it's agitated. So you're looking for the source of, okay, the termites are in the building. How did they get in?
Yeah, we're in total agreement on that. And you can expect, by the way, to have some of your listeners respond very hostily to you, and they're going to say bad things about me. They're going to say bad things about you for having me on the show. And again, that's a sign. We're going to talk about what that is because that's kind of the tragic part
Hmm.
that we're going to get to get to. But yeah, I wanted the same thing. And again, it spawned this book because I think it's really, really needed because unfortunately, this theory is really blowing up. And I think it's going to do harm. I don't think it benefits. I don't think it benefits the good. I think it benefits the other side. Now, I'll get more into that as we go along.
So I just want to ask this before I open up with your phase one.
Yeah.
Is there some sort of connection with like, oh, that's a millennial? Like when they're saying, like, this is Gen Z, this is Gen whatever, and now we're getting into like Gen Alpha. I'm suspecting the final one's probably going to be Gen Omega. Just
Mm.
hyper because why? Because they're telling us you can become your own god with this
Oh,
crazy consciousness aspect. So is there a little bit of a thing there you think of connecting that to the little season?
I don't think that there is a real correlation there. I could be wrong
Okay.
on that,
Okay.
but because I think that first of all, that term millennial came out before this theory became popular, and I think it's just
Okay.
because people who were born. I think the millennials are folks who were either born or grew up in at the turn of this current century.
Hmm.
Like for example, my wife's considered. I'm older than her. I'm Gen X. My wife's considered a millennial because her time was the turn of the century. Basically, people who grew up in the late '90s and early aughts, and we're really it's the internet age is what the
Okay.
millennials are. So I don't think there's a direct correlation. Not that someone might appropriate it as part of the little season, but I don't think that's a direct connection.
Yeah. Cool. Well, it's interesting you just said that with the internet because I think CERN gave us that. They have the logo 666 and Cernonis,
Yeah,
horn
CERN is
god.
CERN is
So
something.
and again, inter means place for tumor corpse, net means to hold or restrain. So I'm kind of
Yeah.
just like, because I have a theory with the Nephilim coming back through the mark of the beast and all that. But anyways,
Oh yeah, so that reminds me. By the way, speaking of books and the Nephilim, I do have a book out now. Again, the little season book will be out in a month, but
okay,
I have a current book out now called The False Apocalypse, Satan's Big Con Before the Tribulation, where I I give my theory about Revelation chapter 6 in the six seals, which is the four horsemen and the seal of the fifth seal with the martyrs and the sixth seal where you have all these cosmic disturbances including this great earthquake which we're going to talk about, that moves islands and mountains out of their place and causes the stars of heaven to be flung to earth.
yeah,
And I believe that the fourth seal, the fourth horseman, brings back the Nephilim because just briefly, I know, well, not to get too far off topic,
right,
but
right,
when
right.
you read about the fourth horseman, who's called Death, the pale horseman, He is given the power to kill a fourth of humanity, and it says does it through war, through famine, through pestilence, and through the beasts of the earth. Now, the first three are understandable. We know what pestilence is; it's disease. We know what war is, obviously, and famines, scarcity of food. But what are the beasts of the earth? Well, this is a place where most Revelation commentators just kind of, gloss over it.
Right.
Apparently, our dogs and cats and parakeets and giraffes and hamsters are going to go crazy and just start biting the crap out of people. But that never sat well with me. That was like, that doesn't make sense. Animal life's just going to go nuts. No, if you look at it in the original Greek, and I always suggest people ask me all the time about Bible interpretation and what's the best Bible to use. And I
Yeah.
say, use an accurate Bible, but what's just as important or more important than the version of the Bible you use is to have a good interlinear source, a source that takes each one of the words in English, because our Bibles were not written in English, and gives you the meaning in the original Hebrew, Greek, or Aramaic. And in the original Greek, which the Apostle John wrote that in, beasts of the earth is a therion gigante or gigantes. Therion means beast, and that's always a spiritual beast. So these are spiritual entities. The Antichrist is called the beast. So is the
Yes.
false prophet and the dragon. So these are spiritual beings. And gigantes means the earthborn. The earthborn is the same title of the Nephilim in the Septuagint, which was the Greek version of the Old Testament in Genesis 6.
Yeah.
They were called the earthborn. That was the name of the Nephilim. So these beasts that are earthborn, these are the Nephilim. So the Nephilim are going to be coming back, and they're going to be partially responsible for killing a fourth of mankind. And I talk about that in detail in that book, which you can find right now on my Patreon. I think it's on Amazon as well. So if you want to go that route.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. No, dude, that sounds awesome. I had a theory
Mhm.
because I think there was a Josh Monday that was saying that the angels might be stars, and again, I was just like, okay,
Mhm.
that's maybe something there because
Yeah,
angels are known
they
as
are.
star walkers and all that stuff. And again, stars on top of Christmas trees are angels. I'm like,
Well,
makes me.
they're called that. I mean, blatantly in the Bible, in the book of Job, when you get
Yeah, he
towards
said
the
that.
end, when God is giving Job his lecture, and he says, where were you when I cast the foundations of the earth?
Yeah.
When the stars of heaven, when the morning stars, the stars of heaven shouted for joy. These are angels.
Mm,
That's what he's talking about. And they're and the stars of heaven are a steady idiom for what we call angelic beings. So when it
yeah.
says in the sixth seal that the stars of heaven are flung to the earth like a fig tree in a storm, basically that means they're violently cast down. This isn't like a rain. These are not meteors. The Apostle John knows the difference between the two. The
Yeah.
stars of heaven means angels, and they are cast out. So these are the fallen angels who no longer have a place in. We see this again in Revelation chapter 12 when it says, the dragon takes a third of the stars and casts them to the earth. I think that's a
Yeah.
part of that same idiom. They are forced out of the heavens and they materialize on the earth. They're forced out. And I believe, this is just in my opinion, that this is what the whole alien Project Bluebeam stuff is
Yes.
all about, because
Yes.
they know this is going to happen and they need to have an explanation for when they are forced out of the heavens and onto the earth. And they're going to say, hey, we're your space brothers, we're your ascended masters, and we're here to help you during this time. And we're being prepped for it.
Yes.
They've been predictive programming for this for, the better part of 50, more than 50 years, a better part of a century.
Yeah. Well,
So yeah.
I was having a hunch because when you
Mhm.
see a lot of these mountains that are all frozen and they look kind of like a giant foot or a giant's
Yeah,
face,
see that. Yeah.
and I was beginning to wonder. I said, "Is this why people were stoned in the Bible? Because it was a little bit of a thing that you're veering away from God.
Yeah.
So as punishment, we take the solidified giant and we slay you with a stone." I don't know. It was something I'm
I have a
pitching to
different
like,
Well, I have a slightly different tact on that. I believe that
yeah,
stoning was made the punishment for idolatry in anticipation for the eighth bowl. I mean, so the seventh bowl of wrath that we see in Revelation chapter 16. Because what happens at the seventh bowl? Hailstones about 100 pounds, about the size of a talent, rain down on fallen on all the earth dwellers, as they're called in the Bible, the people who've taken the mark of the beast, and also the Nephilim who will be on earth, and also the fallen angels. They are stoned, which stoning is the punishment for idolatry. So God ends his bowls, his wrath, by stoning the world for their idolatry.
wow. Okay, so I'm going to use this as the segue.
Sure.
I've heard this as a theory
Mhm.
that like a day is as 1,000 years, 1,000 years is as a day.
Yeah,
I didn't I didn't take the dispensationalist aspect as in the movie End of the Harvest. I'm not sure if you've ever watched that.
I have not. No.
Yeah, it's on YouTube.
Okay.
It's a definitely a thinker because the guy, it's a debate night, and again, it's apologetics. And this one guy said, "I'm gonna," he's all big and tough. He ends up not doing it, and the other guy that actually researched it, he says, "Well, fine, I do it." And then they're all teasing him, and he's like, "Fine, I'll keep going." He unravels this whole thing, and it was really making me think, saying, "Why does God specifically throw in, 6 days, days is as 1,000 years, and all this stuff? Is that possibly since like Garden of Eden, the Earth's almost 6,000 years old. And then we have that millennial reign where we rest with him, right? We're taken
Mhm.
up and stuff like that. That was something that was making me go, yeah. Because because who's to say? Because some say maybe it's 12,000 years. Adam and Eve could have been
Yeah.
there for at least, 1,000 years, whatever. Again, I'm not going to get into all the semantics, too much for me.
Yeah.
But it does make a little bit of sense of saying, yeah, and then he would return on the sixth, and then we reign with him for 1,000 years, and then the cycle would continue again. That one made a little bit more sense to me. What's your take on that? And then opening up with your
Yeah.
phase one.
So I actually just did a Q&A, I think about a week or 2 weeks ago, because I was asked this question about the day is 1,000 years, 1,000 years is a day,
Hmm.
and should we take that literally? And my take on it is that if you look at the two verses that talk about that talk about this, it's Psalms. Oh God, I don't have it. I haven't memorized it, but it's in the book of Psalms where
Okay.
it says, 1,000 years to you is as yesterday. And then you have the Apostle Peter, and it's like in 2 Peter 3:8, where he says, with the Lord, this is the one most people use. With the Lord, a day is as 1,000 years, and 1,000 years is as a day.
Hmm.
But one of the main rules of interpretation is context.
Hmm.
Okay, in Psalms, the context is poetic. This is poetry. So we have to look at it from that context. Is Psalms really saying that this is literally how God sees a day as 1,000 years? Or was he just saying 1,000 years is yesterday? God has a different perspective. Then in the book of Peter, if you look in context of what Peter's talking about, that's why there's a ministry called Stand to Reason, which has been around a long time, and they have a book out called Never Read a Bible Verse, and what it means is don't read the verse itself, read a chapter so you know what's going on around it. And what Peter is talking about in this section is not how God sees time. He is talking about he was talking about people who are scoffing because it seems like God is taking a long time to fulfill his will. They say Peter says there in the later times there will be scoffers walking after their own lust, saying, "Where is the promise of his coming? For since the fathers fell asleep, things are going on as they always are." People are saying, "Yeah, of course, you keep saying God's coming back, but hey, yesterday was the same as tomorrow." And he says, "Well, know this, that with God, a day is as 1,000 years, and 1,000 years is as a day." In context, he's basically saying God doesn't see time the way we do. What's a long time for us may be a short time for God, and vice
Hmm.
versa. What may be a short time for us might be a long time for God. 1,000 years is a long time for us. God is eternal. That's nothing. On the other hand, if you get saved, let's say at 80 years old on your deathbed, God is like, "Oh my God, that took forever. I've been trying to get you saved since you were 5 years old, and you wait till you're dead. It's taking you forever to do that." So that's what I think it's saying. Now, does that mean that the earth is older than 6 7 thousand years? Not necessarily. I think if you look at the genealogies, we do seem to be around 7-ish thousand years old. But notice what I said, ish. It doesn't fit perfectly. And as I'm going to talk about, as I keep going with this, God's prophecies are never vague. They are specific, they are precise, and they are complete. And if it's not specific, precise, and complete, it's not from God, because God does not do things half. He does not kind of sort of fulfill his prophecies. God is exact. So if the earth was if everything happened in exactly 1,000 year increments, and people who are dispensationalists and are using this day as 1,000 years to try to present a timetable of when Jesus is going to return, then that would mean that they would say, well, from Adam to the time of the flood was 1,000 years, because that's how long Adam lived. Well, no, Adam lived 930 years. So, and people say, well, that's almost 1,000 years. Great. God doesn't almost do things like that. And then, well, the time from Noah to Abraham is roughly 1,000 years. God doesn't do roughly. So, I'm not saying that the timing that we're way older than 7 or 8 thousand years. No, I think that's probably about right as far as our current age from the replenishment of the earth until now is roughly that time. But the danger I see in this is that people are using this 1,000 years as a day in order to make these elaborate timelines where they factor in things like, the Jubilee years and Shemitahs and blood moons and the signs in the heavens. And by doing all this crazy calculus and, and multiplying that by 7, because that's the number of perfection, and then divided by 3 because that's holiness, and then add on the square root of the number of toes on a Nephilim, blah blah blah, and doing all this stuff, and that gives us to the year 2031. That's when Jesus is returning. That's the danger. Because if your basis for your timeline is that God sees a day as exactly 1,000 years and 1,000 years as exactly a day, that's a problem, because the Bible never says that we're only going to be around for 7,000 years.
Right.
Now, it seems that we are around that period of time, but the Bible never says that because God created the world in 7 days, that the world is going to continue for 7,000 years. That's an assumption, and we need to be really careful about that.
Fair. Well, that's what I was touching on. We were saying 3.5 years for tribulation, where like it gets really bad. And I was over here like, he doesn't say exactly 3.5 years. He gives exactly days.
Yes.
Days. That's why. So when things do kick off, we literally are going, this is day 1. This is day 2. We have
1,260 days.
Yes. It's
And of
not
course,
something vague.
and the period we call the tribulation, or that last 7 years, again, that's going to be exactly 7 years, and then at the midpoint, then that's when we'll talk about that a little bit. That's when we have the abomination of desolation, and then so once that period starts, then we'll know. I mean, as soon as you see that covenant confirmed with the Antichrist and the many, which is Israel, then you can start your clock. Okay, 7 years from now, we're going to see Jesus, or at least 7 years from now, we're going to see Armageddon. Because I believe that after when Armageddon happens, then there's going to be 3 days before Jesus comes back, according to the book of Hosea. But that's getting into the weeds.
Okay. So anyways, opening up with phase 1 of
Okay.
this little season theory.
So I want to just lay some baseline here and just frame this with a story that actually I'm going to begin my book with. And that is a story of my 8th grade graduation trip, where I live in California, and our class went to Washington, D.C. It's my first time in DC, and I was a kid who was really into history, still am, and was starting to get into politics. So I was really excited about it. And so we go there and we do all the tours. We see the monuments, we see the Capitol building and all this kind of stuff, Smithsonian. But we also went to the U.S. Mint. That was, where they print our currency, our fraudulent currency. But anyway, that's neither here nor there. And while we were there, we visited with a guy who was the expert on counterfeiting. And we saw this whole room that was filled with all these different counterfeit bills that looked, really close to our actual money. And so we asked him, like, how do you tell the difference? And, because there's so many different counterfeits. How do you know how do you know what's happening in the counterfeiting world? And he said, listen, what I do is I don't study the counterfeits. There's too many of them, and they're always coming out with new ones. I can never keep up. What I do is I study the real money. I study the genuine article, and I make sure that I am an expert on our currency. That way, I know the colors, I know the shading, I know the weave and the textures and everything about it. I know that so intimately, so that if I ever encounter any currency that diverges from that in the slightest, I know to question it. And that's what we need. That's what we should do with God's word. Instead of because there's so many theories out there. You have, the little season theory. You have tons and tons of theories. You have a guy right now, it's very popular on YouTube, who's trying to convince people that we're in the tribulation right now, and that Donald Trump is the Antichrist. And this has nothing to do with politics. I'm not going there, but I'm saying that, and he gives his reasons for it. So there are all these theories out there, and which ones do we believe? It can get really confusing for Christians. But you have to be, if you're an expert on the word of God, if you know, like I was saying before, the story of God, when you know his character, his will, his methodology, the way he does things, and you are intimately familiar with that, then you will know to question anything that diverges in the slightest from what we know about God. And again, that's what Faith by Reason is all about. That's what my Bible study is all about. I tell people when they come aboard the Bible study, my goal is to increase your intimate walk with God, because that's what God wants. He walked with Adam and Eve in the cool of the day. That was his will. The Garden of Eden is God's will, that we rule the world during the day, and then in the evening, we walk and talk with him. And if you understand that, then you know everything you need to know about God's character. I'm doing a series on the book of Revelation on my Patreon and YouTube. And the reason I do Genesis is because if you understand Genesis, you understand the whole Bible. The rest of the Bible is essentially commentary on Genesis. But so again, the point is, know the real. That way you can detect the counterfeit. And so what I want to start with is looking at what we know from the Bible about eschatology, the study of last things. And if we know that well, then we can compare it to all the different theories about the end times and see if they match up. And one thing I want to just emphasize that I talked about before, understand how God fulfills prophecy. God does not kind of sort of fulfill his prophecies. Every prophecy that's ever been fulfilled in the Bible, and we have a ton of them, especially about Jesus and his first advent, they're fulfilled completely, precisely, and specifically. Okay, when you look at, for example, probably the most famous messianic prophecy in the Old Testament, Daniel chapter 9, the 70 weeks prophecy. Daniel, God tells Daniel essentially that there will be 490 years for everything to wrap up, but 483 of those years, there from the time of the declaration, the command to restore and rebuild Jerusalem, there will be 483 years until Mashiach Nagib, or Messiah the Prince, Messiah the King. Jesus appeared. If you look at the actual document, the Declaration of Artaxerxes, which is the order, the document, historical document that allowed the Israelites to go back to their land. They've been in captivity for 70 years, and he allowed them to go back. If you start from that point of view and you count 483 years, you get right to the triumphal entry where Jesus presented himself as king. So 483 years, not 485, not 462, exactly that. When we see I believe it's in the book of, was it in Jeremiah, where it talks about that Jesus would be betrayed for 30 pieces of silver. He says, I'm sorry, I think it's in Zechariah, that my price will be 30 pieces of silver. So when Jesus was betrayed by Judas, how many pieces of silver was he betrayed for? 30, not 31, not 28, 30. And you can go on and on about this. It's that Jesus, in Psalm 22, that the Messiah will be killed by being pierced in his hands and his feet. Well, that would have made no sense when it was written during the time of King David, because the execution was done by stoning. Crucifixion hadn't been invented yet. However, how did Jesus die? He was pierced in his hands and his feet. Again, you can go on and on with all the prophecies of Jesus, but they're always precise. They're always specific, and they are always done completely. That is how God's prophecies work. And if someone tells you a prophecy is fulfilled and it's not fulfilled exactly the way God said it would be done precisely and completely, then it's not from God. And that's what you would expect from God, to be complete in his fulfillment. So that's the one red flag. If someone says, well, this kind of seems like no, that's not what God does. That's why, again, it's so important to know God's character, his will, and his methodology. So with that said, let's look at what we can all agree on about eschatology. Not the when, because when it happens and how it happens, well, that's what we theorize and debate on, but we can agree on what happens. So one thing all Christians hopefully agree on is that in the first century, Jesus came to earth. He lived. He had his ministry. He was crucified. He was buried for 3 days and rose again on the third day. And then 40 days later, he ascends to heaven. And the two angels who were there at the time said that, why are you guys looking up? The same way that Jesus ascended to heaven is the same way he's going to return. So we know that Jesus was planning to return in a physical form, because he ascended to heaven physically, and the angel said he will come back to earth in this like manner, meaning he will come back to earth physically in his supernatural body. So we know that is part of eschatology. So after that, at some point after that, the next major event would be what's called the day of the Lord, that last 70 weeks. Remember, we said 490 years of total until the end of sin. Of course, sin hasn't ended. So, but 490 years would be the end of sin. 483 years would be when the Messiah would present himself. Then there's a gap of time. And then there's going to be his last 7 years. And these last 7 years have many titles in the Bible. We Christians call it the tribulation, but it's also called the 70th week of Daniel. It's called the time of Jacob's trouble. But that's going to be the next event that possibly, depending on your opinion about the rapture, and that's a whole other thing. I'm actually going to do a book about that over the summer. So I'm not going to get into that because that's probably the most controversial topic in eschatology. Whether there is a rapture, and if there is it before, in the middle of, or at the end of the tribulation? I'm not going in now, but there will be a rapture event and this tribulation event that has to happen next. That tribulation event, this last 7 years, is initiated, according to the book of Daniel, by a covenant that is confirmed by the entity we call the Antichrist for 7 years with Israel. What's going to happen in that period of time? During that 7 years, that will be the time when what people are referring to as the New World Order comes into place, because the Antichrist is going to rule. He's going to rule the world. There will be we were just talking about the four horsemen. And the four horsemen are going to ride. I believe it happens right before the tribulation or at the very beginning of it. But again, you can read my other book or go to faith.reason.net for more information on that. But you're going to have the white horseman, who is the Antichrist. He begins his campaign. You have the red horseman, who's going to take peace from the earth. So there's going to be massive uprisings, nations rising against nation, as Jesus said in Matthew 24. You have the black horseman, which is economic turmoil, hyperinflation, where he calls an entire day's wage just for one serving of bread. Then, as we talked about a few minutes ago, you're going to have the pale horse, the pale rider, who is going to basically kill a fourth of humanity. If that's so obviously a lot of people through war, pestilence, and famine, and I believe the Nephilim or whatever the beasts of the earth are. And so things are going to be nuts. It's going to be an unprecedented period of time with all these things happening, and this is worldwide. It's made very clear in the Bible that this is happening all over the world, not just in one concentrated area. Then you'll have the sixth seal, where you have this great earthquake that is so great. It's the greatest earthquake up until that time, where every mountain and island are moved out of their place. So we're talking at least, I live in California, so we are very familiar with earthquakes here. This will be something around the magnitude 10 in order for that to happen. So that's going to basically crush cities and knock over monuments. It's going to be terrifying. Then, I'm just going to do an overview of the cataclysmic stuff that's going to happen. And then you have a little later on, you have the seven trumpets. And in the seven trumpets, you have even more cataclysms that are ecological cataclysms. You have hail and fire coming down that burns up all the green grass on earth. So that completely messes up the food chain, because herbivores eat that and the carnivores eat the herbivores. So that's gone. The third of the trees are all burnt up. So imagine the smoke and the soot from that is going to be devastating. You have a third of the waters turn to blood. You have these demonic locusts that come out of the bottomless pit. So these are demonic entities that will sting men for 5 months, and people will be unable to die. I'm not going to get into. I have my reasons for that. You can go to my videos and watch that. My reasoning. Then you have these 200 million demonic horsemen that were bound in the river Euphrates, who come out and they kill a third of humanity. So you had a fourth of humanity killed with the pale horsemen. Now you're going to have another third of the people left killed by these demonic horsemen that have breastplates of fire, and these horses have tails like snakes and scorpions and all this stuff. It's going to be completely nuts, unprecedented stuff, and again, worldwide devastation. And while this is happening, you have the Antichrist coming to power. You have, again, we talked about the angels. I believe that those stars from heaven are angelic beings that are going to be coming down and presenting themselves as ascended masters. But even if you don't believe that, we're talking about, again, craziness. Then at the midpoint, at the 3.5-year point, that's when the Antichrist will suffer some type of head wound. And he'll come back from it somehow. He'll come back different. Instead of being a political leader, now he is a theocrat. He is going to go into the Jewish temple, which will have to exist at that time, and he's going to desecrate it. He's going to stand in that temple and proclaim that he and he alone is God, and he's going to demand worship. He's essentially outlawing all other religions. So there's going to be no more Hinduism, no more Islam, no more Buddhism. You have to be a worshiper of this Antichrist and the dragon under penalty of death. And he's going to force everyone to take this mark of the beast as a part of that worship. And if you don't take this mark, whatever it might be, in your head or your hand or your forehead, you won't be able to participate in the economic system. And then he's going to start persecuting the Jews, the descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and they're going to be supernaturally hidden by God until the end. And then, so at this point, everyone's chosen your side. There's no more atheists, no more other religions. You are either on the side of the Antichrist, and you've taken his mark, or you're a Jewish person in hiding, or you're a Gentile who has decided they don't want to be a part of this, and you're just going to have to survive somehow on your own and try to avoid being killed or starving to death. So now that everyone has chosen their sides, God can now justly judge the world and pour out his wrath. And he pours out his wrath in Revelation chapter 16 on what's called the bowls of wrath. And these are even more devastating than the previous judgments. You're going to have all of the water in the world turn to blood. All fresh water turns to blood. All salt water, all the oceans turn into blood, like the blood of a dead man, which is thick and dark and disgusting. The sun is going to scorch men with fire. You're going to have a dark, God's going to withdraw his light from the world. And it's going to be darkness that's so intense, it's going to cause people physical pain, because we have no idea. It's not just because the sun is darkened, it's because God physically takes light out of the world. And people aren't ready for that. And this is going to culminate with the final bowl of wrath, which we just talked about, where you have 100-pound hailstones just raining down on the earth, crushing cities, crushing buildings. And there's going to be one final earthquake where it's going to be even worse. They're going to make the other earthquake look like, a minor tremor. It says that this earthquake is so intense that it destroys all islands and every mountain falls. There are no more mountains and no more islands. And that's going, and once all that's done, whatever is remaining of the forces of evil, they're going to gather together in a place called Har Moed or Armageddon. And they're going to, that's their gathering place, and they're going to essentially invade Jerusalem. They're gathered together to make war against Jesus because they know he's coming. And this is when the second coming happens. So first, Jesus will rescue the Jews who are hidden. And then he is going to deal with the armies of the Antichrist, and he's going to speak words, and they're just all going to be destroyed. So it's not much of a battle. It's just like the old saying, like, I was in a fight. There were 2 hits. I hit him, he hit the ground. That's what Armageddon is going to be like. And so after that, that's the end of the 7 years. That's the end of the rule of evil on earth. No more will evil ever rule. So immediately, at the end of this scenario, the Antichrist and the false prophet are thrown into the lake of fire, which we call hell. However, Satan, the dragon, has a different fate. He is not thrown into hell. He's actually put into what we can call the penalty box in hockey terms. An angel chains him up and throws him into the abyss, the abuso, the bottomless pit, and seals him up. Why? The Bible says he's hidden, he's sealed away so that he can deceive the nations no longer for 1,000 years. And after this 1,000 years is over, he will be released for a little season. And that's where we get to what the little season. That term little season, by the way, in the original Greek is mikros chronos. Chronos means time. Mikros means tiny. It's where we get the English word micro. So a very short period of time he will be released. And we'll talk about that in a second, what he's released to do. But I want to take a bit of time and talk about this 1,000 years, this 1,000-year millennial reign of Christ. The first thing I want to say, and this is vitally important, is that the 1,000 years does not frame the entirety of the reign of Jesus. It does not. The 1,000 years only frames the time that Satan is locked away. How do I know that? Because the Bible says so. In the book of Daniel, chapter 4, book of Daniel, chapter 7, in the book of Peter, the kingdom of Jesus is called everlasting. Okay? The everlasting kingdom. What does everlasting mean? In the original Greek, in Peter, and in the original Hebrew from Daniel, everlasting means, it's actually a pretty accurate translation. It means never ending. This kingdom of Jesus will never end. It's not ever going away. That is vitally important to understand that. So stick a pin in that. The 1,000 years is just the period of time that Satan is locked away. It's an era for a specific reason. So before we get to that reason, let's look at what's going to be some of the characteristics of this particular 1,000 years, this era, because it's very vivid. And Isaiah talks a lot about it. It's in Ezekiel. It's some aspects of it are in Daniel. But here's what we know. First of all, Jesus will be physically ruling the world from Jerusalem, from the throne of David. That is biblical. So this is a Jewish empire. Now, that may make some people uncomfortable, depending on how you feel about the people who are currently occupying Israel. I'm not going to get into politics of it, but it is the Jewish empire because it was promised to the descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. It is what the disciples, not just the disciples, but what everyone in the Old Testament was waiting for. They knew that this was coming. In fact, the disciples and Jesus' other followers were constantly saying, when are you going to set up the kingdom? We know you're the Messiah. When are you going to set up the kingdom? And Jesus would always tell them, not yet. He didn't say it wasn't going to be a kingdom. He says, it's just not yet. So this is what they've been waiting for. So Jesus will be ruling the whole world. This is biblically a worldwide empire, not local. and he will be ruling physically from Jerusalem. Not only will he be ruling, but he will be ruling with resurrected saints. Everyone who's believed in Jesus from the beginning, maybe Adam and Eve and Abel, all the way up to the day before Armageddon, they will be resurrected and they will rule the world with Jesus in resurrected bodies. Those bodies will be like the body Jesus had when he was resurrected. And if you recall that narrative, he could appear and disappear
Hmm.
at will. He could enter and leave buildings without going through a door, which means he must occupy higher dimensions. So he's a spiritual being, but has a solid body. And so there will be thousands, tens of thousands, maybe even millions of these people co-ruling with Jesus. What is Jesus's rule going to be like? Well, Isaiah makes it clear that it's going to be a time of peace. They will, they'll turn their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. It will be filled with the knowledge of God, and that's probably some of the role of the resurrected saints, his co-regents, filling the world with the knowledge of God. No one will be able to say, "Oh, I never knew who
Right.
God was." Yeah, you're going to know him. It's going to be a time of perfect prosperity, and it's going to be a time of perfect justice. The book of Psalms chapter 2 and elsewhere says that Jesus will rule with a rod of iron. That rod of iron is not a walking stick. It is a king's scepter, and the king's scepter was for executing judgment. And people are not going to like it. I'm going to get to that in a second. But in addition to that, there are going to be changes in biology. Isaiah chapter 11 and 65 say that people are going to live a long time, a very long time. It says that a child will die at 100 years old. So if someone dies at 100 years old, you're going to say, "Oh, that poor kid never had a chance to live a full life." So
Hmm.
it appears we may be going back during the millennium, going back to the antediluvian period, pre-flood, where people lived, 5, 6, 700 years on average. And but if you're a sinner, you will only live 100 years. So if you're a believer, so that means that there will be unbelievers, and by that I mean people who don't accept the rule of Jesus for some reason. They're only going to live 100 years, but the people who do will live for hundreds of years. Also, the animal kingdom is going to change. We see again in Isaiah 11 and 65, it says that the wolf and the lamb will lie down together. Well, wolves are predators of lambs.
Yeah. Right.
So predatory animals are apparently going to become tame. It says a lion will eat straw like an ox. So carnivores are going to be herbivores. And again, this is like it was in pre-flood. People and animals did not eat meat until after the flood. That's in the Bible. That's the Bible is, excuse me, yes, in chapter, I believe in chapter 9 of Genesis is when God says, "Okay, now that the flood's over, you guys have to start eating meat."
Hmm.
So everyone's going to be vegans, which means everyone's going to be annoying because vegans are annoying. They love telling you how veganistic they are. So that's what's going to be happening. So massive changes. The world is going to be a utopia, and people are going to absolutely hate it. Why? Why would people hate this utopia? And again, this is the reason for this era of time. If you look at the history of our world from the biblical standpoint, you can see it as a series of eras where God is trying to contrastively prove that his plan for humanity is the only one that would work. But in order to do that, he has to prove to man that no matter what the conditions are, man will never choose God on his own. God has to intervene. He has to bring about Jesus and salvation because man will never choose God on his own. We
Right.
have, the age of innocence with Adam and Eve. They only had one rule: they not to eat the fruit. And what did they do? They chose to eat the fruit. They wanted more knowledge. Then you have the antediluvian period where God did the opposite. He gave men and women long lives to amass knowledge. And what did they do? Did they serve God? Nope. They wanted angelic knowledge. So they, messed around with the angels and created the Nephilim. Then in Babel, God shortened lives and he said, "Spread out over the earth and rule the earth." And they did the opposite. They gathered together in one city and they built this tower to try to invade heaven. Then you have the patriarchs where God has his own nation and he says, "Treat them well, and that'll be how you treated me." Well, what do? The major empire of the time, Egypt, enslaved them. And then, we have the law, which culminated in Jesus, and they, didn't accept Jesus. He was killed. So, and now then you have the church age where the spirit dwells in man, and that will eventually end as well. So those are all the eras of time where God has done everything in his power to present scenarios to allow man to give man every reasonable opportunity. But there's one more era. This will be the era where man gets everything they say. Well, secular man gets everything they say they want in order to believe in God. If you talk to people who are unbelievers and you ask them, "Why don't you believe in God?" One of the things you'll hear is, Well, if there really was a God and he was all powerful and he's all benevolent, then why is there evil in the world? Why doesn't he judge evil? Why doesn't he stop evil immediately or even before it happens? Well, that's what's going to happen in the millennium. Jesus will be ruling with a rod of iron because the only way to successfully rule unruly humans is to have justice happen immediately. See, what and people are going to get what they want. And here's the problem. When people say, why doesn't God stop evil? They're talking about big evil. They're talking wars, genocide, uh, pedophile rings, sex trafficking, rape, murder. These big, big sins that very few people do.
Mm.
But the problem if Jesus is going to judge sin, he has to judge all of sin. So what people are really saying is, why doesn't God stop the big sins that other people do?
Right.
Well,
It's always pointing the
he
finger.
also
Yeah,
has, he also has to stop the little sins that you do,
yeah. Hmm.
such as lying, cheating, stealing, getting angry without cause. That's a sin. Looking at someone who is not your spouse with lust. That's a sin. Gossiping is a sin. Hypocrisy is a sin. So Jesus is going to be judging people constantly, and they are going to hate it. They're going to say, well, why aren't we free? Jesus, you won't let us do anything. This is oppressive. You're a fascist. But this is what they asked for. Now, what do I base this on biblically? I base it on Psalm chapter 2, which I believe is a millennial. And just to I'll quote it, paraphrasing, because I don't have it right in front of me. It says, why do the nations rage and the people imagine a vain or futile thing? They get together and say, let us against the Lord God and against his anointed, Jesus, that's what Christ or Christos means. Christos, it means the anointed one, Messiah.
Hmm.
So against God and Jesus saying, let us break their bands asunder and cast away their cords from us. That means let's throw off the restrictions. So there is no other time in history where the nations were under God's restrictions. No other time. This is the only time in history. So this is millennial. So these people are saying, let's cast this yoke off of us. We're sick of Jesus judging us. But they said they imagine a futile thing. It's
Mm.
going to be because you're not going to overthrow Jesus. So this is God's way of saying, I'm giving you everything you said you wanted, and you're still rebelling against me. After 1,000 years of the utopia that you asked for, you still aren't satisfied. And to
Mm.
prove this, to put a fine point on it, after this 1,000 years of perfection, he releases Satan for this little season. And what happens here? Oops, excuse me, my phone's going off. Sorry about that.
So could
Yeah,
I just ask one little thing?
all right, yeah,
Um,
I'm sorry, I'm talking a lot.
no, not at all. I just am curious. Who do you think the humans will be that repopulate the Earth? You think it'll be like
Great
a
question.
reboot Adam and Eve, or do you think it will be people who somehow miraculously survived all the stuff that happened, and we just say, okay, we're going to start anew here? Well, what's your take on that? And then, secondly, my biggest thing with the little season theory is I'm like Euphrates River, not dried up yet. It's getting there, but
Oh, that's
we're
one
not
of
there
many,
yet.
many, many, many things. But yeah, that is one of them. Um, for your first question, it's the latter. It's going to be, first of all, it's going to be the Jewish remnant. So we know that there are going to be mortal Jewish people, Israelites. I don't like using Jewish because people get weird about that because Jewish means from the tribe of Judah. But no, it's going to be all 12 tribes. The Bible is very clear that members of all 12 tribes survive. So from Ish, Issachar, Naphtali, Reuben, Levi, all the tribes are going to be there. So whoever they are, I'm not going to get into the whole who are the Jews. That's a whole can of worms. That's going to get me banned off YouTube again. But those survivors are going to be humans, and they're going to start procreating. And it's possible that there are some Gentiles who survive, who I don't know, maybe they have they get into a bunker someplace, and they're able to grow their own food or whatever, but they avoid the Antichrist for this period of time, and they survive. So between them, they are going to survive, and they're going to procreate. And if they have these long lifespans, that's going to give them plenty of time to procreate. So, and there are going to be just tons and tons of people. So that's where the population is going to come from. That's where the nations are going to come from. Okay. So now you have Satan released for this little season. And this is important. What is he doing in this little season? It says, the Bible is very clear that during this period of time, Satan will deceive the nations. He will gather them to against and surround the beloved city, which is Jerusalem. That's the only city in the Bible that God ever gives that kind of affection towards. And why? Because that's where Jesus is. So the Psalms 2, Their nations are raging. They want to throw it off and they're imagining something futile. So what is Satan's deception going to be? He's going to deceive them into trying to do this futile thing, which is overthrowing the world. He's going to overthrowing Jesus. He is deceiving them. It's a specific deception. This is really, really important. This is not general deception. This is a specific deception. So Satan isn't just, oh, I'm going off deceiving and doing my thing. Nope. He has one job and one job only, a specific deception, making the nations believe that they can overthrow Jesus. And they say they're going to surround the camp of the saints in Jerusalem. Why? Because that's where Jesus is ruling from. And then fire will come down from heaven, make short work of them, because God says, okay, I finally proved my point. You guys will never choose me. So God's going to take care of it like that. It says fire comes down from heaven, destroys all the enemies. And then the next chapter, heaven and earth passes away. He gets rid of heaven and earth. There's no more physical world here. Everyone is basically a spirit being at this point. There's no more physical humans left. The good ones have been in resurrected bodies. The bad ones have been physically killed at some point in the past or at this final rebellion. Then you have the great white throne judgment, where God judges all of humanity based on all of fallen humanity who are not saved based on their works, which is what they ask for. Everyone always says, well, I should get into heaven because I'm a good person. Okay, well, let's judge you on how good you are. So again, God gives people what they want. And then people who are not will be separated from God. The ones who are part of God's plan, who accepted Jesus, will be in the New Jerusalem. So that's all of eschatology. But as far as the little season is concerned, the purpose of the little season is for Satan to deceive the nations, to gather them to Jerusalem. Why? To overthrow Jesus. So in order for there to even be a little season, number one, Satan has to be deceiving nations specifically to surround Jerusalem and deceive them to battle. And Jesus has to be in Jerusalem. If Jesus isn't in Jerusalem, there is no little season. Why would there be? That's like saying, okay, the two football teams are going to play, but one football team isn't in the stadium. Well, you're not going to have a game. In order for there to be a little season, you got to have Jesus on the throne. Otherwise, what's the point of it? So that's eschatology as it's laid out. I didn't say when it's going to happen because that's the debate, but that's what's in the Bible. So I'll let you give your thoughts and then I'll go on to my comparison.
Yeah, that's kind of something I've been trying to figure out, and I'm not sure if it's like the Tartaria thing. I'm not sure where they're trying to fill in this missing gap of like 1,000 years of our history, and it's just
Yeah.
and I'm like, no, it says again. I do take the John, I think 3:36. My kingdom is not of this world. Why? Because he brings heaven down to us. I don't see streets made of gold. That's like one thing that I'm over here like, okay, don't see that. I don't see the Euphrates River drying up. I don't see like this massive devastation wasteland that somehow after all of that we're just, where did Christ go? There's this missing link for me where I'm like, where did he go? If all this has already been done, so this little season. So are we telling me Satan gets 6,000 years? Again, varying on however they start explaining that one. It doesn't make sense to me, but what you're defining, it does, because I think as in Psalm 82, as Heiser was saying, we sit in judgment over them. So, and I kind of suspect, like we get Genesis 3, sorry, is it 4:6? The sons of God came down, or is it 6:4? I think it's 6:4. 6:4. Right? And then we get over in First John, I think 1:23. I'm guesstimating. Behold, what manner the love of the Father, that we should be called the sons of God. Like almost as if I'm looking for people who were loyal to me, as opposed to a rebellious heavenly council, and by that you are now inducted in to the heavenly celestial council. Why? Because you proved, despite all the crap you went through down there, that you wanted to be loyal to me. And I'm not seeing that with their explanation. What I'm seeing is kind of like a pseudo grasping at straws. Like that it doesn't make anything concrete, because as you said, the Bible is a bookend. it's here for a reason. And I'm noticing a lot of Christians, again, not going to get into the whole rapture thing, but it's
Yeah.
almost like they look at Revelation like, well, yeah, okay, cool book, but rapture, I don't really need to care about all the rest of it. And you just throw it out. It's not
Mhm.
important, not relevant to me. And I'm like, no, everything, what was and what is, it's going to mirror reflect what happened at Babel with the son of perdition. And
Yeah.
people aren't looking into that. And when I see these people write little season theory, I said, everything that I'm teaching will not make any sense, because I go into Nimrod and all this stuff.
Yeah.
All this will not make sense to you, and it doesn't make sense with that format, because what I'm explaining is where the secret societies come from, origins, their history, and
Mhm.
their end game objectives.
Yeah.
What you're telling me with your little season thing, it just doesn't, like, it's like trying to force a puzzle piece in an angle that it just does not go in, and it's like, stop doing that. You have the picture right here, right? The picture on the box, and you're trying to create something that just doesn't fit.
Yeah.
Again, that's my 2 cents, but I would love for you to elaborate.
Yeah.
Um, this might be your your closing statement for 20 something minutes. If you could, where you find the fallacies, where the origins of this little season was pitched, and what is the ultimate end game? Where how do you think that might tie into Project Bluebeam and or
Yeah.
End Times Prophecy?
So listen to the fallacies, and I can spend 2 hours easily just talking about all the things that don't match up. But let's just look at the cataclysms of Revelation and of the of the tribulation. You touched them a lot. You touched on a few of them, like the river Euphrates drying up. That is one, but there are many others. There shouldn't be any more mountains or islands. The Bible
Mm,
says that very clear. They're gone. Guess what? There's still mountains and islands. There's one I can see. I live near a mountain range. I see it right now. It's right there. Why is it still here? What about islands? I'm a scuba diver. I've been to many islands in my lifetime. They're still there. My
very
family and I, we vacationed in Hawaii last year. Hawaii islands. So why are there still islands here? Why is there no evidence of all grass burning up? There should be geological evidence of this. This doesn't just happen in a vacuum. Even if it happened 1,000 years ago, a third of the trees growing up burned up. We have ancient forests all over the world where we have trees that are 2,000 to 3,000 years old. That shouldn't be if a third, unless all these ancient trees just happen to be in the third of the 2/3 that weren't burned up. Okay, fine. But we can go on and on looking at all the lack of evidence. And some of the little seasoned people will throw things out like, well, I had one say, well, a third of the earth is desert, so that must be where the green grass used to be. There's a problem with that. There were maps of the earth before the first advent of Jesus, and guess what was there? The Sahara Desert, the Gobi Desert. They were already there. These are not they were not lush grasslands that suddenly
mm,
became deserts. Mount, not so. Why are there still mountains? Did Jesus raise the mountains back up? I guess that's theoretically possible, but why would he raise them up again exactly where they were before? We have old maps. Mount Fuji, Mount Kilimanjaro, Mount Olympus are exactly where they were before. All the islands in the Aegean Sea. So you're telling me that Jesus raised the island and mountains back up exactly the way they were, with the exact same topography, with the exact same fossils on them? Is that
mhm.
really plausible? It's not about what's possible, because people, you can argue all day what's possible. The little season people do it all the time. It's not about what's possible. It's about what's plausible, what's
Right.
actually reasonable, and how much are you willing to bet on it being real? Are you willing to bet your spiritual future on it? That's a good question,
Mm,
because as far as possibilities, I could argue it's possible that I could dunk the ball over an NBA center. It's possible. Is it plausible? Seeing as how I'm a middle-aged guy who's 6'1" and hasn't played competitive basketball in 20 years, it's possible. Plausible? No. And would you be willing to bet your all of your finances on it, your house, your investments? I wouldn't
mm,
do it if I were you. Because even though it's possible, it's not plausible. And how much credence are you willing to give it? So there's no physical evidence that the events of Revelation happened. And some people, they'll point out the things. They'll say, well, there's evidence of meteor strikes, and there's certain buildings that are melted here and there. Great, but what did I say before about how God fulfills prophecy? Completely,
yeah.
specifically. Is there evidence of the specifics of Revelation, of the trumpets and of the bowls? No, there isn't. I mean, if you want to just talk about cataclysms, we can hop on a plane right now, fly to Japan, go to Hiroshima, and we'll see some evidence of cataclysm. But does that mean that a nuclear bomb went off during the tribulation, that happened during World War II? No. a, Random cataclysms and evidence of random cataclysms don't prove that Jesus already came back and that the tribulation happened. So they have to be specific. All right. So Yeah, again, I could go on and on about that. But the question you asked was great. It was really good about where's Jesus? And where's all the things that happened in the millennium? Why aren't people living for hundreds of years? Why did that stop? Why are animals no longer tame? There's no self-respecting sheep farmer who's going to let a wolf in there with the sheep because he'll eat them.
Right.
When did that change? Where are all the saints that ruled with Jesus? I don't see any around here. There aren't. All
Mm.
the changes of the millennium aren't here. We're going to talk about Tartaria in a minute because that's what they try to counter with. But there's no evidence of any of the things that, and the Bible is very vivid about what the millennium will look like, and there would be evidence of it, and there absolutely isn't any. And ultimately, again, where did Jesus go? So that Jesus apparently came here, ruled for 1,000 years, made this perfect utopia, then said, "Peace out, I'm gone. Take it easy." Oh, and Satan's in charge now. Bye. No, the Bible says that in Daniel 4, Daniel 7, in 2 Peter, this is an everlasting kingdom. It will not end. Jesus is not going to rule for a while and then leave. That does not work. Everlasting means exactly what it says, everlasting, without end. This is not halftime where Jesus went to the back to get a Slurpee. Jesus is never going to leave. And if he did leave, then there's no little season, because the point of the little season is to overthrow Jesus. If Jesus isn't ruling from Jerusalem, then why does Satan need to overthrow him? And if Satan doesn't need to overthrow him, then we're not in the little season according to what the Bible says. We can't get around that. Jesus is not leaving. He was not going to, he shouldn't go anywhere, but he's not here unless if Jesus is ruling from Jerusalem right now, he is the worst king ever because this world sucks. He's doing a terrible job. And I don't believe, knowing the character of Jesus, knowing the purpose of Jesus, he would not be a bad king. And if he is ruling the world right now, he's a bad king. If he's not ruling the world right now, then we can't be in the little season, because the purpose of the little season is to gather the nations to battle to overthrow Jesus. The Bible is extraordinarily clear on that.
So
So
just a
go
little
ahead.
pause. Do you think that possibly this connects with what we get in is it Timothy or Thessalonians, where people say that, they'll say that this is Christ and that is Christ over here. That connects with the Christ consciousness, collective consciousness, and this is, oh, we find Christ within, and that's
Yeah.
why that's why we can't find God down here or Christ, because we have to just focus on ourselves. Which again, I'm like, I always tell people with the New Age is that it's not about finding within, it's about submitting to him, and because
Right.
you're inverting that, you're not going to understand. Do you think this connects with this?
Well, yeah, it was Matthew 24 where Jesus says there will be many false Christs that come along. Understand what
Right,
Christ
that
means.
stands for.
Christ is not Jesus's last name. Okay.
Right, 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 right.
Even though my uncle would always say Jesus H. Christ whenever he stubbed his toe, it's not his last name. Christ is the Greek, is the transliteration of the Greek Christos.
Right,
Christos
right.
is the Greek for Mashiach, Messiah. So it's a specific person. When someone says, "I have Christ consciousness," really? You have the consciousness of the Jewish Messiah? No, people have just appropriated that for their own, which is basically what Catholicism does. They just
Yeah.
they take the paganism and Christianize it. So the New Age people, they're taking the name Christ and just paganizing it and making it New Agey. No, Christ is not a consciousness. Christ specifically, the dictionary definition of Christ is Christos, Mashiach, the Jewish Messiah. It actually refers to the Jewish high priest. The Jewish high priest is because Messiah means the anointed one. And the
Right.
anointed one was the high priest, and Jesus is our high priest. But that's what he is. So if someone says they have Christ consciousness, ask them, okay, so you have the consciousness of an ancient Jewish high priest. How does that work? So no, so yeah, that's that. So that's But as far as you did bring up something very interesting that's going to get into the agenda behind it,
Right.
and that is the people who say, well, that there's not going to be a physical millennium, that Jesus rules in our heart, and we are that, and we are the kingdom of Jesus. And yes, he said the kingdom of heaven is within you, not the kingdom of God. There's two different things. The kingdom of God is a physical
Right.
kingdom. The kingdom of heaven is spiritual. Why did God say the kingdom of heaven is within us? Is because he gave us kingdom power.
Right.
Okay.
Right.
He gave us
Right.
the
Yeah.
power over the fallen realm, over the Elohim realm. That's why Christians should be able to cast out demons, just like Jesus did. He gave us that power. And So let's talk about Tartaria because I want to get into that because people, the little season people will always say, well, you need to study hidden history. There's 1,000 missing years or 1,000 years that was added to to our calendar. Why? Because Satan was able to cover up the the 1,000 years of Jesus.
Right.
Really.
Right.
So if Satan was able to hide, let's understand this. 1/3 of the Bible is prophecy, it's end times prophecy.
Yeah.
So you're telling me that Satan has the power to hide 1/3 of the Bible. How does he do that? Either God allowed it, God endorsed it, or God's powerless to stop it.
Mm.
None of those three things are God's character.
Mhm.
So that means that God is either indifferent, he's deceptive, or he's weak. God is neither of those three things. Satan cannot hide what God wants. Satan cannot hide 1/3 of the Bible being fulfilled. God would not allow it. And if you understand the character of God, you know that. So you're going to tell me that Satan hid 1,000 years of the greatest kingdom ever? If he could do that, why wouldn't he take the easier route and hide the first advent? If he could hide 1,000 years, I mean,
Mm.
wouldn't that be in his best interest? Because Jesus was only here for 33 and a half years. And of those, only the last 3.5 years were really significant. That's his ministry, life, death, and resurrection. And that period of time, he only was in Israel, this narrow strip of land about the size of New Jersey on the coast of the Mediterranean.
Mm.
You telling me that Satan couldn't, and we know he didn't hide that because Christianity is at least nominally the most popular faith system on earth. The Bible is everywhere. Everyone knows about Jesus. So you're telling me that Satan couldn't hide 3.5 years of a ministry that was only in Israel, yet somehow he was able to hide 1,000 years of a worldwide kingdom, supernaturally ruled by the co-creator on earth and thousands of supernatural co-regents?
Yeah.
Does
Yeah.
that seem plausible to you? And would God allow it, endorse it, or be too weak to stop it? Those are questions that you really need to ask if you're embracing this little season, because that's what would have to be. Now, so let's get into Tartaria. I know we only have a little bit of time left, so I want to get to Tartaria and then get to the agenda. So the Tartaria is essentially this area in North Central Asia called the Tartary, and it's been getting a lot of attention in the last 10 years or so about the Tartarian Empire, and that is very vital to the little season theory.
Mhm.
So apparently, this empire was either a worldwide empire or at least influenced the world, and these Tartarians were very advanced spiritually, mystically, and technologically, and it was embodied by these buildings that they would build, these huge ornate domed buildings that we see all over the world. And apparently these buildings had advanced technology. Theorists say that they were able to get ambient energy from the atmosphere, so we had free energy.
Yeah.
They were acoustically set up in a way that they could actually heal people. They would resonate with the vibrations of our bodies and all this kind of stuff. And they had these buildings all over the place. And then, so they was advanced culture of peace and love and harmony. It was a utopia.
Mhm.
But then for some reason it fell. The reasons for it are, no one seems to know exactly. There are lots of theories behind it. But apparently it fell somehow, and there was some type of mud flood that happened where many of these buildings were flooded in mud and buried, and the Tartarian people are gone.
Mm.
And when they left, and we're the remnants of it. Our modern society came up in their place, and the people who rule our society, the evil rulers of the world, they decided that they didn't want us to know that knowledge. So they went about systematically destroying as many of these Tartarian buildings as they could to hide that are glorious paths from us. So they would just knock them down, or their theories about the world fairs, where the world fairs were built around these existing Tartarian buildings. And when the
Yeah.
fair was over, they say, okay, we got to knock all this stuff down, get rid of the fair. So that was their excuse for knocking down the Tartarian buildings. But a few of them remain. A lot of our Capitol buildings in states and even our federal government were actually Tartarian buildings that have just been appropriated, and we can't build them anymore. We don't know how, and we just have our shoddy buildings to this day. The little season people say that this is actually proof that there was an advanced utopian society, and that must have been the society that Jesus created during his 1,000-year reign. So this must mean that Jesus was here. He created these buildings, or he commissioned that they be created. They heal people, which is how people live these long lives, and we had free energy and so forth and so on. Okay, So what are the problems with that? Well, the big problem is there's just like everything with Little Season, there's little or no evidence for this. Because again, I'm working on my book right now, and look, Tartaria is fascinating. Don't get me wrong, and I'm not dismissing the idea of Tartaria completely out of hand, but does it really relate to Jesus? I mean, many of these buildings, it's not. I think there's an easier, practical, economic explanation, and that is, a couple hundred years ago, when many of these buildings were apparently built, labor and materials were much cheaper.
Hmm.
So you could pay an artisan, a little bit of money, and you get cheap labor to build. A little bit of money to design them, and then you pay a bunch of people basically slave wages to build these. And it would take time. They would build them. They were ornate. Why aren't they doing it now?
Yeah.
Well, a couple reasons. One, you have the population grew. You have the population of the world in about 1850 was about 1.2 billion. It's about 9 billion today. The United States was 23 million people. So there was no need to build things fast. You could take your time and build them in these ornate ways. But what happened around the turn of the last century, you had massive immigration, and people were migrating to the cities. So they had to build things quickly, cheaply, and efficiently. This was around the same time as the steel industry was growing. So steel manufacturing, you can make steel quickly and cheaply. And concrete, which is basically sand and some binders, cheap. So now, and you also had labor unions, which made things more expensive. Labor was more expensive.
Mhm.
So you need to get things built quickly, cheaply, and efficiently. So you're not going to make these big ornate buildings anymore. You're going to make skyscrapers made of concrete, glass, and steel. So I think that's a great explanation. I'm not dismissing all the Tartarian buildings because the economic reason doesn't explain everything. But the biggest thing is, how does this relate to Jesus?
Mm.
Just because you have these advanced buildings that defy explanation, and I agree, they're what I just said, the economic explanation does not explain everything. But just because there's a mystery doesn't mean you can just automatically plug Jesus into it. There has to be some kind of evidence. There's a saying in the statistical world which says that correlation does not imply causality. Just
Mm.
because two things seem to have a relationship does not mean that one caused the other unless there's corroborating evidence. Really quickly, there's a famous data set about the rate of divorce in Maine and the rate of consumption of margarine. And if you put those two statistics together on the same chart, they're almost identical. So
Mm.
does that mean that the consumption of margarine causes divorce in Maine? No, not unless you have corroborating evidence. Not unless you can say that that the butter versus margarine debate was the reason that people got divorced in Maine. Okay, that's corroborating evidence. Absent that, you just have two charts that look alike. It's the same thing with Tartaria. Just because you have this mystery of what looks like possibly an advanced civilization that people still can't fully explain, doesn't mean that it was created by Jesus unless there is some type of corroborating evidence. Shouldn't there be something carved into the building saying Jesus was here or
Yeah.
here's what was happening? Why aren't there paintings inside of Moses and Abraham fishing in the Mediterranean? Because they would have been resurrected during this time. I'm being facetious, but
Mm.
there should be something about these buildings that say this was the kingdom of Jesus. And as far as I can tell, there isn't any. And of course, the little seasoned people say, well, they just covered it up. They painted on top of it. Well, here's a problem with that. The absence of evidence isn't evidence.
Mm.
The only thing the fact that there are no paintings of Jesus in Tartarian buildings doesn't mean they were covered up. It just means that there are no paintings of Jesus. It's
Right.
like if I were to call my car insurance company and say, hey, you know what? Someone stole my Ferrari. You guys need to reimburse me for it. And they say, okay, well, where's the evidence that your Ferrari was stolen? Well, it's not in my driveway. So obviously someone stole it. No, that's not going to work. I have to show evidence that I owned a Ferrari before anyone is going to believe that it was stolen. The absence of my Ferrari, all that means is there's no Ferrari in my driveway. It doesn't mean that I owned one and it was stolen. That's not corroborating evidence. So that's it for Tartaria. I could spend a lot of time on that, but I know we're running out of time. I want to get to the agenda behind it.
I just
So,
want to throw this in real
yeah,
quick.
yeah, go ahead.
Like what we have with all this Bible evidence of kind of finding the ark, at least an outline of something looks very similar. Mount Sinai. We found Sodom and Gomorrah. If we're able to find all these, where they crossed the Red Sea, if we're able to find all of these aspects of Old Testament confirmed, these catastrophic or miraculous events,
Mhm.
how come we can't find it with this particular thing for 1,000 years? That takes a lot of I think we're over accrediting the devil's abilities here. Sorry, just
Yeah. You can get into so many things. Like, if we had all these great earthquakes, why is Stonehenge still standing? Why are the pyramids still standing?
Mm,
I mean, just it really, and the excuse that the little season people give you, one of the ones I get so many. It's like it's called cafeteria conspiracy theorists. You just take the parts of the conspiracy theory that fits, and you just throw those at me, and you ignore all the rest.
yeah,
That's not how research works. Everything has to fit. Otherwise, you're not making a good argument.
yeah.
And they'll say, well, you're taking this literally. God didn't mean that literal mountains and islands would disappear. No, it's allegory. Okay, here's the thing with allegory. You do not have carte blanche to decide what is allegory and what is literal in the Bible based on whether or not it fits your theory.
Hmm.
The Bible is very specific about what's allegory, and there are rules around it. Everything is there allegory in the Bible? Absolutely, tons of it. There's allegory, there's poetry, there's metaphors, but it's always clear. If someone, if when Daniel interpreted Nebuchadnezzar's dream of the statue made of the four metals, how do we know this was not a literal statue? He said it was a dream. And secondly, it was interpreted. God is not the author of confusion. He always interprets what he talks about. Later in Daniel, in chapter 7, where he has a vision of the four beasts, the lion, the bear, the leopard, and the indescribable beast. In that same chapter, an angel tells him that these are four kingdoms, and he gives the explanation. In Revelation chapter 1, the apostle John sees the vision of Jesus, and he is walking among 12 lampstands with 12 stars, excuse me, 7 lampstands with 7 stars in his hand. And at the end of the chapter, Jesus says, oh, by the way, those 7 lampstands are the 7 churches, and the 7 stars are the angels of the 7 churches. God
Mm,
always provides. He does not give you allegory and then run away. He gives you allegory, and then he explains what it is. You see this throughout the book of Zechariah, all in the prophetic books, where they do see visions, but we know they're visions, and they're always explained. So
right.
the book of Zechariah is full of Zechariah saying a vision, and then Zechariah saying, what does this mean? And then it gets explained to him. You don't get to decide it's allegory or not, just based on whether or not it fits your theory. And since it talks about the mountains and islands being moved, literally, I mean vividly in the Bible, and not just in Revelation. You see it in Isaiah, where it says that the earth is utterly shaken, the earth rocks to and forth like a drunkard.
Mm,
The earth is utterly shaken. You see, it's not just in Revelation, it's all over. Remember, I said a third of the Bible is end times prophecy, and they all say the same thing. There will be physical devastation. Jesus says that this time, the time of the tribulation, will be unlike any other time in the Bible, including the flood. It's going to be worse than the flood, and the flood was a worldwide catastrophe. So
mm.
there would be physical evidence of these catastrophes, and there simply is not. Let's get to the agenda.
Yeah, sure, sure.
So when I put my video out and I talk to people about it, I always get a bunch of crap from the little season people. Do more research, blah blah blah. You need to listen to this, that, and the other person. So I started listening to them. I said, okay, if people let me hear what a reasonable response is to this. And as I listened to them, I started to notice a commonality. They would all eventually make the same statement to justify the little season. They would say, and it goes a little something like this. They said, well, Jesus had to have returned in the past because he promised his disciples that he would return during their lifetime. And as soon as I heard that, it started falling into place, the agenda behind it, because that idea that Jesus promised that he would return during the lifetime of his disciples, which comes from Matthew 16:18, is the key verse of a group called the Preterists, who believe in an eschatological system called Preterism. There are different flavors of Preterism, but for the most part, Preterism espouses the idea that most of prophecy has already happened, and and most of it happening in the first century.
Mhm.
Again, based on this idea. So they look at that idea. So let me quote quickly from Matthew 16:18. Jesus is talking to a group of his followers, and he says, truly I say unto you that there are some of you standing here who will not see death until they see the Son of Man appearing in his kingdom.
Mm,
Preterists interpret that as meaning that appearing in its kingdom, meaning the second coming. So that means that there are some of them, a subset of the people who Jesus was talking to, would be alive to see his second coming. So that means it had to have happened in the first century. That was a lifetime of the people who were there. So you have to look in the first century. And the problem is that there's no definitive history, no evidence that Jesus returned in the first century. So they have to find the closest approximation to that. and they lean into the siege of Jerusalem in 70 AD. Why? Because the siege of Jerusalem is a period of time when Rome basically destroyed Israel. But Israel was
Right.
always, the Jews were always rebelling. They got tired of it, and the Emperor Titus, I'm sorry, the Emperor, Titus sent his son, the General Vespasian, and several Roman legions, and they just completely sacked Jerusalem, destroyed Israel, literally wiped it off the map. They renamed Jerusalem. They renamed Israel after their ancient enemies, the Philistines. They called it Palestinia, which is where we get the word Palestine to this day. They destroyed the temple, burned it all down, and that was that. And so the preterists say, well, this must have been the tribulation, because the tribulation is called the time of Jacob's trouble. Jacob is Israel. And this was a time when Israel, in the first century, where Israel experienced a lot of trouble. And since this is the tribulation, then at the end of the tribulation at 70 AD, which was the end of the siege of Jerusalem, Jesus must have returned then.
Mm.
Of course, again, there's no evidence of it. Titus Vespasian would have to be the Antichrist, which he wasn't. He never went into the temple and declared himself to be God. He never instituted the mark of the beast. All the worldwide calamities didn't happen. There's no evidence of it. However, the preterists stick to it because, again, Matthew 16:18, Jesus said, there are some of you standing here today who will live to see me appearing in my kingdom.
Mm.
Okay, and if they were right, then it had to be in the first century. Problem is, they aren't right. They completely misinterpreted it. They failed in the rules of interpretation. Rule number one, Bible is not written in English. That word for kingdom is the word basileia. Basileia does not mean a physical, literal kingdom. It means royal glory and authority. And in my video on the little season, I actually put a screenshot and circle where it says not a literal kingdom, just in case somebody missed it. So what Jesus is saying, there's some of you who are alive right now who will see me appearing in my royal glory and authority. Okay, second rule of interpretation, context.
Mm-hmm.
What was Jesus talking about in Matthew 16? It's not a prophetic chapter. He was not talking about prophecy. He was not talking about his second coming. Matthew 16:18 is about, Matthew 16 in that section is about Christian living. It is the famous verse where Jesus says, if anyone will come after me, he must take up his cross and follow me. A cross is obviously, it's tough. It's harsh. So he's saying the Christian life will be difficult, but then later on he says you will be rewarded for your bearing the cross. And he says, when you die, I will stand at the right hand of my Father, and I have the authority to give you that reward.
Right.
So Jesus is saying the Christian life will be difficult, but you will be rewarded. I have the authority to give you that reward. And there are some of you standing here who will live to see me in that royal authority. When does that happen? Not 40 years later or 70 AD. It actually happened 6 days later. How do I know that? Because I turned the page. You know what comes after Matthew 16? Matthew chapter 17. What happens in Matthew chapter 17? Jesus takes 3 of his disciples, a subset of the people who were standing there previously, to Mount Hermon, Mount Bashan, and he is transfigured for them. His face shines like the sun. They see him as royal glory. And he's talking with Elijah and Moses. So Christian life will be difficult, but you will be rewarded. I have the authority to give you that reward. Some of you will see me in that royal authority. 6 days later, some of them see him in that royal authority. Done. Prophecy fulfilled. So why do people believe this preterism theory? Because it did not exist in any mainstream form before the 1600s. Where did it come about? Preterism was invented, and this, you can look this up, it's easily Googled. It was invented by a man by the name of Luis de Alcazar. Luis de Alcazar was a member of the Society of Jesus, otherwise known as the Jesuits. Preterism was invented by the Jesuits. Again, go Google Luis de Alcazar preterism. It'll come right up. In fact, there's a Wikipedia page on it. That's how mainstream it is. And preterists don't even deny this. They try to say, well, even though a Jesuit invented it, that doesn't mean it's bad. Yes, it does, actually. The Jesuits were created to counter the Reformation, true Christianity.
Yes.
So if your enemy, and they were created to, again, to infiltrate and to obscure and to undermine Protestant theology, especially their eschatology, because their eschatology stated 2 things. One, they say the Pope was the Antichrist. And secondly, they said that Jesus was coming back. This is 2 things the Vatican did not want. The Vatican is amillennial. This is their official policy, that there is no real millennium. Why? Because, as my old mentor Chuck Mister would say, the idea of Jesus coming back to overthrow the evil rulers wouldn't be very popular with the evil rulers.
Mm-hmm.
And
Mhm.
that's what, and I believe the Catholic Church, the Vatican at least, rules the world to this day through their banking system. But that's a whole other thing.
Right, right, right.
So they created the Jesuits to undermine it. And this is what Luis de Alcazar did. He created Preterism, which again did not exist mainstream before this. And they infiltrated the church with this idea of Preterism. So, and yes, it is bad coming from the Jesuits, because why would you believe something from your enemies whose stated goal it was to undermine you? I mean, that would be like if the Ku Klux Klan wrote a treatise on the intelligence of minorities. And it was,
Mhm.
well, just because the Ku Klux Klan wrote it doesn't mean it's biased. Yeah, it does. The Klan is the enemy of minorities, just like
Yeah.
the Jesuits are the enemies of mainstream Christianity. So yes, it matters. So how does preterism help the Vatican? Easy. If Jesus came back 1,000+ years ago, if he came back in 70 AD, well, then there's no point in looking forward to him coming back.
Correct.
He
Yeah.
came and left. And if Jesus came back, that means he was preceded by the tribulation and the Antichrist, meaning the Pope can't be the Antichrist, because the Antichrist already came and went and had his career, and Jesus came back after it. So there you go. And
Mhm.
so
And
people who
answer
are,
and was
yeah,
a vicar of Christ literally means
mhm,
substitute. So they're already stating
exactly.
it to a very good extent.
Yeah, they're
Uh,
saying that they are the kingdom of Jesus. So that's
yes.
nefarious. So if you are promoting the little season, then either overtly or covertly, you are doing the work of the enemies of Christianity, of the Jesuits. And I'm sure
Mm,
they're pleased as punch that this is becoming popular in Christianity, because preterism has always been a very small but very vocal group of, of eschatological people. They are not popular. They have never been, but they are extremely well funded. Wonder where
yes.
that funding is coming from. But anyway, but they see Tartaria, and they saw, oh, wait a minute, here's a new way for us to wedge
Better.
our dumb theory into it, because we have this mystery, and we can just say, hey, you know what? These advanced buildings you can't explain, we can explain it. It was Jesus. Is there any evidence for it? No, 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 no. But it was Jesus. Trust me. And that's why it's becoming more popular, because it's well funded. Funded by
Yeah.
who? Well, I'll let you use your imagination.
Mm.
So I
Well,
want to, yeah, go ahead.
I'll throw this at you, but like even the thing with the mark of the beast, I was it's at an event the other day, and I got sat at a table with some fellow Christians, and I was trying to break it down. I'm like, yeah, in the occult, 6 neutrons, 6 electrons, 6 protons. It's breaking down the atom to rebuild Adam, man, in our own image, right? Create God, we become our own gods. And again, I'm looking on Mason pages, the Masonic find, and it says, "Are you ready for the future, brother?" And it's showing a metallic man with a Masonic apron on his. I'm like, I could have been wrong, but it's like it's so freaking obvious when you get to the Empire of Iron and Clay. It's man mixing with machine,
Hmm.
and the 10 toes being the Club of Rome. So it's like
Possibly,
so
yeah. Well, there are
yeah,
10 kings who are going to give
different
the kingdom
districts
over to the
of
beast in the end.
Atlantis, which could make sense with the stuff that Heiser's dug into. But for me, it's like it doesn't make any sense when they're trying to say, "Oh, look, it's like where's the 666 with Antichus or wherever his freaking name is." I'm like, I don't see that
Yeah,
there. I see potential of that happening now.
right.
So, anyways, your
Yeah,
summary, and
yeah,
we'll cut it out.
yeah. I'll wrap it up here. I know we're over time, but this is really important, because you have two agendas. You have the nefarious agenda that I just talked about with the Jesuits and their agents
Yeah.
who are propagating this, but there are also another group who have a more innocent agenda. And while I have contempt for the folks who are trying to mislead Christians, I actually have sympathy for the ones who are the victims of this, because as I said, when you counter this theory, you have all that emotionalism. You have people coming out just throwing anything against the wall. You're wrong. You need to do more research. You're a tool of the elites. And I would wonder, why are people fighting me so hard against this? Why are
Mhm.
they throwing out all this ridiculous, spotty, specious circumstantial evidence? But as you alluded to before, because my background is in psychology and mental health, when
Okay.
people are emotional about something, it's because they have psychological comfort from believing it,
Mm.
and they rebel against anything that disturbs their psychological comfort. Why would the little season give people psychological comfort? Well, understand how our brains work. Our unconscious mind, which is 90% of our brain. People say we only use 10% of our brain. That's not true. We use 100% of our brain. We're in conscious control of 10% of it. The other 90% is our unconscious, and that would control our heartbeat and our eye blinking and our breathing and all that kind of stuff. So it's 9 times larger than our conscious brain. It's 9 times more powerful. And it communicates with us not through words, but through feelings. So when you feel depressed or something like that, that's your unconscious trying to get you to slow down to take care of some issue that it has. Your unconscious just only sees patterns and it sees reality, and it wants you to see reality, and it wants you to be in line with reality. And the one thing your unconscious mind hates more than anything is a contradiction.
Mm.
If your unconscious mind encounters a contradiction, it is going to bug you. It's going to send emotions at you until you resolve it. Then it'll make you comfortable. What is the contradiction that many Christians see? Well, there are two views. View number one, we serve a loving, all-powerful, benevolent God in Jesus. That's one view. View number one, the reality is we live in a world that is unrepentantly evil, that is full of
Mm.
evil human beings doing unspeakable, inhuman things. That's a contradiction. How can you have a loving, all powerful God and then have this world that is completely the opposite of God?
Right.
It almost seems as if God abandoned us and that Satan's in control.
Mm.
That's a contradiction. And that bugs you. It bugs people in their minds. And then along comes the little season theory, and it resolves the contradiction.
Yeah.
And it says, Jesus did abandon you. You're right. He came, he set up his utopia. You weren't a part of it, and he left. And now he put you on an orphan train. We didn't even talk about the orphan trains.
Don't know with Heidi. Yeah,
He put you on an orphan train and now you're under the power of Satan. And Satan's in control right now. He's deceiving the world. And hey, look, the world is under deception.
yeah.
Jesus isn't here. He's abandoned you. And that's where we are. We have all we can do now is hunker down and hope for the best and just try to endure Satan. Now, it's a bleak and hopeless worldview, but it resolves the contradiction. There's no more contradiction between the loving God and the evil world.
Yeah.
God's gone. He left. He came, and you just unfortunately you happen to be born during this era where Satan is in control. And so then along comes a guy like me, and I say, we're not in the little season. Here's all the evidence that we're not. And you hear that, and your unconscious mind, 9 times bigger than your conscious mind, says, no, I don't want that contradiction back.
Mhm.
So you're going to reject this. I'm going to communicate with you through your emotions. I'm going to make you angry. I'm going to make you push back against this guy because he is bringing back that contradiction we already resolved. And I hate contradictions more than anything else. You are no, absolutely not. Push back against him. Don't accept it. Anything he says has to be wrong because I don't want that contradiction back.
Mm.
So when I realized that, I stopped feeling the hostility and frustration that I felt against the people who were arguing with me, and it was replaced by sadness and compassion.
Mm.
So I want to end by saying this: if you disagree with me, if you're for the little season, I don't want to debate you. I don't want to fight you. I want to help you. I want to help you resolve the contradiction because that's the root of the problem. We could go back and forth about evidence, and you could throw orphan trains at me and insane asylums at me and Tartaria and stuff. You can keep. It's not going to help. Because the root is you are dealing with a contradiction, and I want to resolve it. I want to resolve it because there actually is no contradiction. There is no contradiction between a loving God and an evil world. Because and gets back to what I said at the very beginning. Understand how God works and his methodology.
Mm.
Things always get bad before they get better. This is throughout the Bible. That is his pattern. Look at the flood. You got the Nephilim running amok. You had Noah and his family possibly being the only pure humans left. When it says he's perfect, Noah was perfect in his generations. That means there was no physical blemish on his genetics. Things look way more hopeless than they do now. But what happened? God intervened as he said he would. He destroyed the enemies, and he set Noah up and gave him a new land.
Mm.
When the Israelites were in Egypt, 400 years, it looked bleak and hopeless. But what happened? God intervened like he said he would. He destroyed the evil. He had the 10 plagues. He had the Israelites freed with riches, and they went to their promised land, just as he said he would.
Mm.
Look at Jesus, the promised Messiah everyone had been waiting for. He comes to the earth. He performs miracles. He's wonderful. People kill him, and then he's in the grave. It looked hopeless. It looked bleak, but God intervened, just like he said he would. He raises Jesus from the dead, defeats the enemy of sin and death, and then he gives us the power to become the sons of God and be
Mm,
saved. That is a pattern of the Bible over and over again. Things get worse, and then God intervenes as he promised. Yes, this world is bad. Things are terrible, and they're going to get worse, but things are unfolding exactly the way God said they would. God
yeah.
said at the end times, there would be a one world empire. I think it's pretty clear that we're headed towards that.
Yeah.
All the things that are happening right now are unfolding exactly the way God said they would before and during the early parts of the tribulation. So I want to say this to you. God has not abandoned you. Okay? Jesus has not abandoned you. He never would, and he never will. That is not in his character. Satan is not in control. He never has been. He never will be. God has not turned his world over to him. God would not let him cover up his glorious history. He couldn't do it in the first century, and he couldn't cover up the 33 years of Jesus' life. He will certainly not cover up 1,000 years of his kingdom. He has
Mhm.
not abandoned you. He has not abandoned you, so don't abandon hope.
No.
There is no contradiction. We are right where God said we would be. He is in control. He knows what's going to happen, and he is preparing us for it. Because, and I'll end with this, because I'm accused of being an agent of the bad guys. Let me ask you this: which point of view would actually aid our enemies, the elites? If you believe in the little season, then you believe that Jesus abandoned you. Jesus is basically a deadbeat dad. He came
Mhm.
back. He came back. He gave you a bunch of gifts. Then he left and went. I guess with he went back to his mistress. That's who. And there's no hope because now Satan is in control. So who do you think that benefits? Not looking forward to Jesus, believing that Satan is in control and there's nothing we can do about it, and God is not going to help us. Who does that benefit? On the other hand, if I'm right and we still have our blessed hope, and we're going to go out and evangelize and teach Christians and try to live moral lives and be like Jesus. Who benefits more from which point of view benefits the elites more?
Mm.
Hopelessness and a God who abandoned us, or hopefulness, morality, and a God who is coming back, and a Jesus who is coming back to overthrow evil. So keep that in mind, and then ask yourself, who is really the agent of the elites? Who's really controlled opposition?
Nice, nice. And this, I'll throw this on there. I think it's John 1:14. That the word became flesh and dwelt amongst us. And I think Revelation 19:13 says that when Christ returns, it is the word of God return. His name is the Son of God.
Right.
So what does he say? Heaven and earth will pass away, but my word will never pass away. Christ does not just dump you. No, you're his ecclesia. You are his bride. And he's coming back to return. And in summary, one thing I found very interesting with Joshua is, if Yeshua, what does he do? Marched around Jericho,
Mhm.
blows the trumpets, right? And what is Christ going to do? He's getting ready
Yeah.
to return after just causing the plagues, and then he's going to sound the trumpets, and he
Yep.
returns. It's mirrors, and it doesn't fit little
Right.
season theory. So, anyways, Ed, thank you for coming on. Please shout out again all the places people can find you, find your work, and one more time with the book, and then I'll close us out.
Sure. So my main website is faithbyreason.net. That's where all my legacy material is. I'm really trying to guide people towards my Patreon, patreon.com/faithbyreason. That's where you can find my book, like my current book on the false apocalypse, and the upcoming book on the little season, which will expound on everything we talked about today. That'll be available in a month. It'll also be on Amazon and all the Apple Books and all that other stuff. I'm also on YouTube, and I have a presence on X and Facebook. So I just kind of farm things out all through there. But yeah, go to faithbyreason.net and Patreon, which are the two main places to find me. Patreon.com/faithbyreason.
All right. Perfect. Well, again, folks, thank you for tuning in to another episode of the Manna Daily Podcast, and I will catch you on the next one.